Thank you very much. What we wanted to talk about was about the making of an idea. As architects, we spend an awful lot of our time in the building process, but there's still, I suppose, that initial reaction to the site or approach that obviously makes it a lot more makes it more than building, and it's about the realization and the materialization of that idea that I wanted to talk about. So, is about the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. It's a very large museum that's located beside the pyramids, and start with there's Egypt, and Egypt is. It's really created around the Nile Valley. If you talk to most Egyptians, they'll say that Egypt is all about the Nile. The desert is, well, of course, it surrounds Egypt, but Egypt exists because of the Nile, because of this very, very narrow strip of green land that comes up to the delta and then opens out to the Mediterranean. And that was created as the Nile actually carved its way through the desert. So the valley is 40 or 50 meters lower than the desert which surrounds it. And of course the pyramids, the desert was a place of death, so the pyramids were built on the desert, and our site was just located just where the valley meets the desert. So it was located at that plateau where there's a 40 or 50 meter difference. So that's roughly 16-story difference across the site, about the height of Liberty Hall. The site is actually located here. It's a large site, 50 hectares, which I think is about 120 acres. There are the pyramids, so it's quite close to the pyramids. And you can see there, that's the Nile coming right up to it. And there's quite a difference in the soil as well between the valley and the plateau. So the way we organized the site was that we wanted to keep the museum below the plateau level, but we organized it around this view to the pyramids, so that if you're in the exhibition area, in the museum proper, that you have the view to the pyramids. Because it was a chance to bring together, if you like, the artifacts of that pharaonic period with the pyramids, which of course are one of the greatest artifacts left over from that era. And there you have the museum there. It actually occupies a small space in the middle of the site. So this is looking back. You can see that the museum is actually embedded into the plateau. The roof is level with the top, and there's the valley there as it drops away. And the expression, or what you see of the museum, is actually in the facade. It's this huge stone wall that creates a new edge to the plateau. It's 50 or 60 meters high at this height here, but probably about 55 around there. And then it drops down as it goes, and it's almost 800 meters long, so it's a very, very large stone wall. And that facade during the day, it's this quiet stone wall. You just see a very simple stone facade, but it's made of translucent stone, so that as it changes to night, the facade actually changes to become this backlit wall. And in a way it reflects, I suppose, the importance of the sun god in Egyptian culture. As the sun went down, this transition from day to night. But even now, in the evening, Cairo is alive. Well, Cairo is always alive, but people come out at night because of the so hot during the day, it's got this amazing night culture. So in some way, we wanted the museum not just to be about that whole pharaonic past, but also about Egypt as it is today. So that was the idea. And then we had to try to figure out how to do it. So the first thing was the stone. We need 4 football fields of stone in order to clad that stone wall. That is an enormous amount of stone. That's just for the stone wall itself. We needed to find a quarry that had 2 to 3 times that amount of stone because there's a lot of waste. So we worked with Arab on this, and they spent about a year researching quarries all over the world. We needed stone that was strong enough to be cut fairly thin so that it could be illuminated at night, and also exist in the quantities that we needed. We're looking at an onyx. Onyx tends to be quite fragile. It's almost semi-precious. You can see here some of the cracks in the quarry. The problem with all of that is if there's a lot of cracks, we don't get a whole lot of stone out of this, and we need a lot more than our 4 football fields of stone. So after about a year's work, we ended up with 10 stones, 10 potential quarries that that had the potential for the stone, that had the quantity, and also could be backlit. At that point, then we had to go through an extensive testing process. You can see here, this is the room that was built for the testing. Needed to test how the stone reacted over time, so it was accelerated aging. So you can see here the stone panels, they're UV lamps. So there was about a 4 or 5 month testing process. There are some of the stones that were tested. There's the control samples in granite, so we had to test for strength, for UV degradation, a whole lot of things. And out of that process, we had about 2 to 3 stones that we could potentially use. So that was one element of the work, the stone. But the stone was actually 20% of the cost of the wall. The other thing was the steel structure to support it. The wall is actually freestanding out in front of the museum itself. The museum, I should say, is not just one building. There's 2 or 3 elements within it. There's a museum and a conference centre. And this stone wall kind of creates this unified element in front of the whole thing. So the next thing was the steel. It's about 800 metres long, and it is about 16 stories high at that point. So it's a very large stone wall, okay. And I'm going to look at one triangle there of it. What we did was, in order to try to structure the wall, we used a triangle, which is quite stable structurally. So you can see there's a person, there's our basic module. We started to subdivide it. You've seen something like this if you see pylons for electricity, where you connect the midpoints, you continue to subdivide. It becomes very structurally stable in one plane, which is what we wanted. We didn't want a lot of structure behind the wall. The other advantage of that is all the triangles are the same size, which is quite efficient in terms of cutting the stone. So we're getting a lot of repetition in the stone. So there was our structure. And then we subdivided the remainder with tension cables. So that's what we ended up with. But at that point, we had a triangular wall that, after all this work, was very flat. And in a way, you wouldn't see all that patterning. So we started to think about that a bit. We realized that at some point, the steel was going 50 metres. At other points, of course, because it was connecting the midpoints, it was much smaller. So we could start to use the depth and reduce the depth as you subdivided the wall. And subdividing it along the pattern started to give us this. So that's the final design for the wall. So you can see there is the large panels, and as they start to get subdivided, they move back in plane, which you start to see the structure or how the wall has been generated in the actual depth of the wall. So in a way, the design of the wall was derived from the making of the wall, but of course it all came from that idea at the very beginning of making this freestanding translucent wall that kind of changed over the course of the day. The next project is the Giant's Causeway Visitor Centre. You probably know the site. It's on the north coast. Quite a beautiful site. And it's Important because of the geology. It's World Heritage Site primarily because of the geology, also the landscape. But of course, it's also been a very important tourist site. And one of the reasons that people come there is because you can actually get to it quite easily. There are other sites that have this geology in Scotland, but they're very, very hard to get to, but you can get to the Giant's Causeway. And that's the other thing that's very important about the site, is this whole history of tourism. It's been a tourist site from the 1700s. It's very important to the area. It's important that the visitor centre helps support people coming to the site, but also to try to make a better experience on the site. So what we wanted the building, we had two elements that we needed to design in. There was the visitor centre, the building itself, but there was also the car parking, because everybody coming to that site, well, not everybody, but most of the people come by car. So the car parking was a really important element. We didn't want to design a building that then just gets surrounded by car parking. We had to deal with it at the beginning. So we felt there were two elements to the site. There's the car park and there's the building. And another thing that we wanted was that when people come to the site, they actually become aware of this whole cliff path. It's not just about the Giant's Causeway, going down to the Giant's Causeway itself. It's actually about walking along the cliff, about seeing the whole scenery, being aware of the area as a whole. So we want people to have a sense of that when they come to the site. There is a slope across it, so we made two cuts in the landscape. One's cut into the landscape to hide the cars, and the other is cut out of the landscape to hide the visitor centre, so that drops down. We excavated quite a lot of soil there, and one comes out and the building is there. And then in between there's a ramp that leads up to the cliff path. So that as you come, the first thing you see is this ramp that brings you up to the cliff. So you're aware of what it is about the site. You don't have all of that visitor centre stuff that you have to deal with before you see the scenery. It is about seeing this natural landscape. The other thing was, these are the columns, the basalt columns. They're tall, thin columns. So in the building expression, we wanted to somehow express that geology, which of course the site is so famous for. So we had this idea of, as the building comes up, expressing the facade as basalt columns. So that was an image that was done. It was a competition. So that was an image for the competition. So you can see these columns as they're extruded up, and the building then is actually tucked in underneath. And then there's a car park there, which is kind of tucked into the ground. Actually, I gave a talk on this very recently, and at the end of it, somebody said, "Where is the building?" So we had to come back to that slide, but it's actually in there. And I think maybe that's one of the things that's successful about it, that it's not so easy to see the building. So then actually, so that was the idea, and now how do we start to make it? So first of all, we had these two very, very man-made cuts in the landscape. They're orthogonal. The car park is this whole part here. The building is actually much smaller than the car park. We drew these lines over the side because we wanted to unify everything so that there was a continuity about it. And it was interesting hearing Richard Seymour, where he said, he talked about, will anybody see it? And probably nobody will actually necessarily be aware of this, but we do believe that having this continuity will actually affect your perception. And then we start to subdivide within that, and that starts to structure the columns. The basalt, then, was the next issue. The basalt this is it. These are some quarries. In Northern Ireland, the basalt is not particularly great as a building stone. In fact, it's most commonly used as a hardcore underneath roads, and the reason it's not good is it's very brittle. Well, I don't know if brittle is the word, but it has a lot of fissures through it. You can't cut it thin, and for buildings, we usually like to cut stone very thin. It's very strong in compression, which means you can stack it up. Not so strong in tension or flexurally, so if you kind of put it over like a tabletop, it would tend to break unless you had a very thick piece of it. So if you look at in compression, say there's a Doric column, works in compression, stacks it up. The reason it stays upright is because it's very, very chunky. But we wanted long, thin columns. So while we wanted to stack the stone, it wasn't going to work very, very well. It was going to fall over. as you kind of feel. So there's the stacking. But what we decided to do, or us with the engineers, I should say, was that we stack the stone, and then we thread steel rods through it, tighten it, and that gives it the tension. Well, it keeps it standing upright. That's kind of a non-technical way to express it. The other thing we had to deal with was the fact that the stone we weren't exactly sure how big sizes we could get out, so we made these control lines, the red lines there, and then we allowed the remaining lines to, the stone sizes to vary. So depending on what they were getting out of the quarry, you could have a lot of variation in the stone. And then the other thing about it, and this is again, this is a bit, I think, our obsessiveness with controlling things, but you've got these lines that go across the site, like that there. And we wanted always to have that geometry that cuts across, because there's so much happening on the site that we wanted the building and the car parking and everything to be fairly uniform. So we bring these lines across the site, but what that means is, as you look in detail, so this is looking across one of these bands, the stone columns on this side are different to the stone columns on this side, are different to the stone columns there. So that as you look around you, it'll kind of change your perception inside the building. And then they vary. There's a whole series of modules. So this is one of them on site. So you can see there the kind of this cut geometry. You can see there the holes for the tension. That's there to keep it in position as they stack it. This is it being stacked. This is actually at the top. So you can see there, this is the plate that ties it all together. There is a capping plate coming up on top. So this is a competition view of the interior, and the idea is that from the interior you don't see out over the cliff, but you look back over the landscape. You can see here at this stage the columns are very, very light. They're actually going to have much more presence because they're stone and they're not see-through. Apart from that, it's a fairly simple interior, and this is actually a photo taken inside. The stone obviously isn't up here, but you can see there, you'll have that view. What you're actually seeing here is the hoarding. And that's it. Thank you very much.